Welcome back to Carinine, in which we are sharing a conversation about taxation and the economy in the Bahamas. And at the break, we're talking about the banks and the need for us to exercise greater monitoring controls over the banking industry in the Bahamas. And I was making a point about the Canadian situation where we are allowing the Canadian government to make more money out of Bahamian banking than the government and people of the Bahamas are making. That should be a turnaround if we're going to enjoy an equitable situation.
That's right.
Because we can't derive anything from the Canadian banks in Canada.
Well, you know, Archbishop, it's also more perverse than that. We have seen recently a contraction in our Bahamian banks that have head offices in Canada. We've lost a lot of jobs to Barbados. And they will say that the reason we have done that is because the banks in Barbados can operate more efficiently. I doubt that that is the case. But we've seen virtually all of the Canadian banks pull back on their operations. We've seen, for example, at First Caribbean Bank, they've moved their money wire department entirely to Barbados, and so that no one is employed now in the Bahamas, or very few persons, if any, are employed in the money wire department. That is really, in my opinion, something again that the government should be calling the banks and saying, listen, if you're going to conduct banking in this country, we want you to be sure that before you lay people off, or you move these jobs, transfer these jobs to other Caribbean islands, that we have a clear understanding of how you're going to replace those persons who are being disposed of. Because what's happening is that it's not only in the bank's financing, but it's also in its human resources behavior that we see a negative impact on the economy, because the people who were working previously in that department are no longer working there. Persons who were working in other departments are no longer working in the departments they were working before, because, again, in many ways, the bank's cry would be that, well, we need to move to a more efficient level of operation. And you cannot tell me that the Bajans or the Jamaicans or the Trinidadians, others, can do it more efficiently than we can.
Especially with modern technology.
Precisely.
And there's an argument that, well, only the government can make that argument.
That's right.
And the government must have the necessary moral courage to be able to say,
well, yes,
this is the business being conducted in this country.
That's right.
And we have these expectations.
And I think the other thing that the government can do, quite frankly, is that they can, because of their influence on Bank of the Bahamas, implement policies or persuade policies to be implemented there that don't follow the lead of the Canadian banks. That they can offer lower rate of interests. They can provide other kinds of offerings or services that the Canadian banks don't offer, because the decisions are made here, and the government owns the majority interest in the Bahamian bank.
Well, that's an area that I wanted to get to, because I mean, I feel very strongly that government as government should be seen to be promoting Bank of Bahamas.
That's right, I agree, 100%.
And it's part of our national aspiration.
Absolutely, and there is no reason whatsoever why we should allow the offshore banks to be so far ahead or to be able to do the things that they do. And, you know, for example, if you remember the recent outcry about the losses that were incurred by Bank of the Bahamas, all of the other Canadian banks, everyone without exception, had losses. But there was not a single peep out of anybody about the losses that were incurred there. Are we giving them a free ride because they're foreign? Is it because they're white-owned? Is it what is it that allows us, or because they're foreign? You know, because they're able to do things in this country that seem to be acceptable, that are not acceptable when it's done by our locals.
And that is part of what we call almost a cultural thing in the Bahamas.
Yes, it is.
That we have to deal with.
Yes.
But in terms of government policy, isn't it also a question of what do we expect of the central bank in terms of, because the government must say and legislate in terms of what it expects the central bank to do.
I think so. I think indeed it is. And when you talk about the central bank, you're talking about that area of the bank called bank supervision, the bank supervision department, which I think has not done a particularly outstanding job. I look at many instances where it seems as though some of the banks, commercial, Bahamian and non-Bahamian banks, are able to impose criteria on Bahamians for opening the accounts that they impose also on foreigners, but it seems to be particularly onerous. And I would think that the Central Bank of the Bahamas can say that, listen, our role is to monitor and to supervise you. You want to make sure that you're compliant with your anti-money laundering rules and regulations and so forth. But we don't expect you to treat Bahamians like criminals when they come into your bank to open an account, because that's exactly what happens in many instances. Many Bahamians can speak to the experiences they've had with opening accounts. Fortunately, I work in an area and with banks who are, who I think know me and know my firm, and therefore may not be as onerous on persons like myself and a few others. But the average person going into a bank has to go through a real gridiron in order to open his account. And Central Bank can say, we are going to require you to be more responsive and less prone to prohibit persons from opening accounts or to make it difficult for persons opening accounts. In addition, the central bank can say to, and it has said in the past, that we require, in the case of certain loans, a certain amount to be deposited by the consumer before loans are offered. I think that as the economy improves, some of the tight guidelines that are provided by the central bank can be relaxed a bit. And I think what the central bank should be doing is saying that let's see what we can do to increase credit, not to reduce it or to thwart credit, because clearly there has been a problem as a result of the recession primarily with non-performing loans. And clearly the central bank wants to have a good handle on that. And I think the central bank, in that regard, has done a fairly good job. But I also think that there are other areas of supervision that need to be looked at very much more closely and make it much less difficult for Bahamians to do business in their own country.
And underneath all of the provisions must be the overriding intention that whatever we do is to assist in the improvement in the economy.
That's right. And I'm not sure that is always the underlying motive that guides people. I think that sometimes people become so insular in their business activities that they believe that it's their responsibility to make life difficult for some people. I think that is their mantra in some instances. The way we want to see this country go, in my opinion, is that we want our banking system to be sufficiently open to the possibilities where persons who are able to produce valid, sustainable, feasible business plans with adequate security are able to get the financing in order to grow the economy, because that is really the only way that we're going to be able to expand and increase our GDP, our gross domestic product, by people getting into business, by people staying in business. Some banks have done a good job. I don't want to hit all banks, because some banks have done a good job of helping people along the way during difficult times. But it's, if we're going to continue the growth, and if we're going to come out of this recession with any lessons well learned, and with a better grounding for a positive trajectory to move this country forward, then we're going to have to see banks that are more amenable to helping people get into business, just as governments have to be more helpful in creating the environment for businesses to
grow and to flourish.
That's right.
And in addition to that, we have the additional problem of the annual addition to the workforce of a few thousand young people.
That's right.
In most cases, with nowhere to go.
That's correct.
So that the creation of opportunities would have to be a major objective.
Well, I would think that, and I think government, and I'm not quite even sure if I answered the two-part question you asked about how the government is doing with respect to creating opportunities for Bahamians. I think that if anything, this government, the current government, has seen the wisdom in recognizing that if we're going to grow the economy, it has to rely on both. There has to be a twofold approach. One, foreign direct investment. And there's a tremendous amount of emphasis placed on foreign direct investment. And by that we mean foreigners who come into the country, make investments here, and in many instances obtain concessions in order to do so, making it relatively easy for them to get into business if they have a viable business, if they have the funding, if they have the business plan that looks like it's achievable. The government then moves along fairly quickly to approve those kinds of investments. Equally important is for the government to be able to understand that there are Bahamians with equally valid and feasible business plans that need their assistance in moving things through the system, whether it's Foreign Investment Board approval, National Economic Council approval, any other work permit, sometimes work permit approvals in order to make things happen. The role of the government in the modern Bahamas has to be to facilitate the ease with which people are able to get into business and the environment that allows them to be able to sustain themselves in business.
I would go further to say that I believe it is the responsibility of the government to even identify areas for young entrepreneurs to at least look at, and not simply to stand and wait for them to come asking for help. I mean, for example, in our major industry of tourism, surely we could spend a couple $1 million researching and identify areas of activity that would offer opportunities for business growth and development for people who are not presently in business.
No, you're right, because the government knows better than any other agency of this country where the needs are and where the needs are being met and where they're not being met. And it really ought to be done in tandem, that assessment of areas where growth is likely ought to be identified by the government. It ought to be communicated to the educational system so that we can prepare and train Bahamians for these activities or these job opportunities going forward. We can't wait around. We cannot just sit around and wait for the Bahamas and the Atlantices to come along. They are few and far between. And while they're going to impact many thousands of lives and create many jobs, they are really a very few opportunities similar to those that are going to really be available to Bahamians. It has to be the smaller businesses. It's always been the small business that sustained economies.
And as important as the contribution that the foreign direct investors make, the reality is that in so many instances, the opportunities they give to Bahamians are at the lower level.
That's correct. That's correct.
And that's not a pathway for real development.
It
really is almost a form of subservience.
It is indeed.
And so I think that if we're going to continue to pursue the FDI, as this government is obviously hell-bent on doing, they must have a similar thing to see to it that not only restraints are placed on them, but the benefits and the exemptions that they get really need to be reviewed.
They need to be reviewed and
too many things have been given away.
That's correct.
You can see a similar direction towards the local Bahamian.
That's right.
That has to be redressed.
That should be reversed. In fact, as we get more and more, as we begin to benefit from the foreign direct investment that we have obtained in this country, the focus ought to shift now to the local entrepreneur, to the local businessman, to the Bahamian business person, to find ways and means by which we can help to bolster them, to give them the same kinds of benefits. They may not in some instances, but sometimes they will bring the same amount of money and the same amount of talent to the table. But commensurately, there ought to be a focus placed on small businesses if in fact they're going to be encouraged to participate. Anything short of that is really servitude, because we become then servants of the foreign direct investor. We become, we get the menial tasks. We don't have any equity in the business. And I think the final thing that we can, that a government, a forward-looking, progressive government, should seek to do is when foreign direct investors come to the country, they should make it a policy that we will give you this and this, provided you take so many, you offer so many of your shares to Bahamian investors. You let the Bahamian community participate in and share in your investment.
And another thing I would want to attach to that is the government needs to be more vigilant in determining what I call the attitudinal problem.
Yes.
Because so many of these foreign investors
Mm-hmm.
come with a very negative attitude towards our people.
That's correct. That's right.
They may not express it verbally, but that attitude is there in the way they relate to and how they treat people.
That's correct. That's right.
And I think it is the role of the government to say that this is not acceptable and to put that into the heads of agreement in some form. I don't know what the legal thing would be, but
Sure.
you need to draw the attention to these persons that here in this country, we expect you to respect our people and to treat them.
And we will not
as
tolerate. We will not tolerate
tolerate
disrespect for our people,
people.
particularly in the absence of with what appears to be a waning union movement, a movement that's not as powerful now as it was previously. There has to be a check on persons who have these attitudinal problems, and it's unfortunate, but you can't really quite discern those patterns when you're discussing around the table with them coming to the country. It's only after they're here and after they're established that you start to see these attitudes emerge. But it's something, again, that has to be clearly looked at. We have to be vigilant of. I mean, it happens. You have to bring it to the government's attention.
Good. Well, we must take our final break for the evening.